if you believe the president's words at face value, the goal here is regime change. But if we've learned anything from Donald Trump, it's that you shouldn't actually take his words that seriously. You should take his actions seriously. And in terms of what President Trump is doing, it doesn't look to me like he's trying for regime change. This is going to come down to timing. How long can Iran stay in the fight and have its regime continue to show resilience versus how long can the United States and Israel continue the pace of attacks, continue to have enough interceptors to deal with the rockets that Iran is firing and also the stamina of some of the other countries in the region. So I would be very surprised if we go more than 2 or 3 weeks on this. That would start to put a lot of pressure, I think, on the Trump administration in the United States. I think you put it perfectly. This is not about regime change. This is about a change in behavior. Just like getting rid of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela was not about regime change. It was about putting in Delcy Rodriguez, somebody who was going to change Venezuela's behavior. So I think President Trump is looking for that kind of figure in Iran. And as soon as he gets that figure who's going to say nice things, he can claim victory on the reality television show and move on to whatever's next on his list.
Jacob, and we were just going over some of the sharp rhetoric coming out of Beijing, but in terms of actual action, what are you expecting from China?
There's not a whole heck of a lot China can do here. So I expect China's rhetoric to be out there, but I also expect that Xi Jinping and Donald Trump are going to have a successful meeting next month. I also think that if China's really looking at the board here, that they have options. Now, again, if this goes to 2 months, 3 months with the Strait of Hormuz closed, okay, then things start to get a little bit dicier for China. And then China maybe needs to think a little bit more desperately about where it's going to source oil and where it's going to figure these things out. But if I'm China and if I have a good read on what the United States is doing, and I expect that I have an understanding with the White House and I understand how the White House works, there is nothing gained by inserting itself here. China has been dependent on importing energy supplies from the Middle East for quite some time. And I think it watched what the United States went through in the 90s and early 2000s, and it doesn't want to repeat that movie. It doesn't want to be dependent on the region and have boots on the ground the way that the United States did. So I think China will say all of the things that it just said. It will say them louder, but I would be extremely surprised if China took the extremely risky move of trying to unblock some of these things themselves. I don't think they have the capacity, and I think they would do more harm than good. So for better and for worse, I just don't see a high likelihood that there's going to be a lot of activity here. The one thing that China can do is it can try and put pressure on different actors. So it can try and put pressure on Iran to meet U.S. terms, or it can try and put pressure on the United States to say, okay, you've achieved this. But that pressure is best done behind the scenes, not in embarrassing people in the light of day. In the light of day, China needs to be seen standing up to what China sees as a flagrant violation of Iran's sovereignty and security. It doesn't like the precedent that's being set, but China shouldn't like any of the precedents that the Trump administration's been setting for the last 6 months. So.
You mentioned Trump's expected visit to China in just a couple of weeks now. How do you think the situation in the Middle East will impact the negotiations? Because when the SCOTUS ruling came out against Trump's ruling, a lot of people were saying that will weaken Trump's hand vis-a-vis, well, China's president, but also everyone else. But does this conflict, this attack in the Middle East impact these talks?
No, I don't think it appreciably changes the talks that much. I think people want to link what's going on in China with what's happening in the Middle East and what the U.S. is doing there. I think people wanted to do the same thing with Venezuela. And I think that misunderstands what the U.S.'s intention was in Venezuela. I think it misunderstands U.S. intentions in Iran. And I think it misunderstands U.S. intentions with China. I think the United States wants some kind of trade deal, something to show for this back and forth with China going forward. And I mean, I thought that the tariffs were going to be struck down. If I thought that, I assumed that the Chinese were smart enough to know that the tariffs were probably going to be struck down too. I think that was part of what was animating their trade strategy. And instead of them agreeing to something before they had the Supreme Court ruling, like some other countries did in a sort of desperate manner, China was willing to be patient, willing to let the United States come to them, and will probably get a better deal out of it. Like I said, I think the one thing that maybe comes out of it is that President Trump can try and push for China to purchase some oil from the United States. And if the United States is going to sell it cheap, I'm sure China will be happy to buy it. This is not about where the oil is coming from. If the price is right, I think China will go there. The one thing I will say is if you zoom out a little bit, I will say that if you look at a map of Eurasia, I mean, there is now a crescent of military and political unrest stretching from Ukraine all the way to Pakistan. Remember, Pakistan and Afghanistan are at war again, too. Ethiopia looks like it's gearing up for a war on the Red Sea. Sudan is on opposite sides with the Emiratis backing one faction, the Saudis backing another faction. You've got Iran, you've got Turkey and Syria. that's a huge crescent of activity, and none of it has started overlapping. But the more systemic instability you introduce into Eurasia, and the more chance you have for some of these conflicts to start overlapping in ways that even analysts like me can't predict, that is the sort of thing that I would be worried about if I was Beijing, because that introduces a lot of predictable variables. If I'm sitting in Beijing today, I think I sort of know what the next moves are, and nothing here changes my strategy with the United States and what I've been building towards ever since Trump came back to office.